If one winter morning, your horse refused to return to the barn as usual, circling nervously by the creek, snorting and pawing at the ground as though warning you that something terrible was waiting ahead, what would you do? Would you stop and heed the instincts of the animal, or would you push forward, risking whatever lay in the shadows to find out? Out here in the west, where dry grass cuts like knives and the north wind slices to the bone, every strange sign can mark the line between life and death. And this time, what happened to Ethan Ward changed his life forever. Before we dive deeper into the tale, let me pause to speak to you, our listeners, especially those of you who've lived through enough years to know that life always holds sharp turns. If what you hear sparks something in you, please press that like button and let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I promise, this isn't just another Western yarn. This story holds sudden turns, tense vigilance, and heart-stopping moment scenes that may well remind you of your own past when you had to face the unexpected. Now, let's return to the Wyoming frontier. On a bitter late autumn morning, Ethan Ward stood by the weathered gate of his corral, shaking a tin bucket of grain. Normally, that sound alone would send his horse, Ranger, trotting eagerly from the pasture, nickering for breakfast like a boy rushing home for supper. But today, the gelding didn't budge. He lingered far out by the creek bank, head low, hooves scraping, ears pinned forward towards something unseen. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. Ranger wasn't the kind to spook. Through storms, hunts, and long winters, he had always been steady. Ethan set the bucket down, latched the gate, and crossed the brittle grass. Each step cracked loud under his boots, breath fogging white in the frigid air. His old war wound tugged painfully at his ribs, but he pressed on, eyes fixed on the horse stamping harder at the edge of the cut bank. And then, Ethan saw her. Lying, crumpled in the dead grass, was the shape of a young woman. Long black hair tangled with burrs, a deerskin dress torn at the shoulder, dark blood stiff across the fabric. Her knees were scraped raw, and one thin arm clutched the ragged end of a broken leather strap as if she had ripped herself free from a binding. Ethan's heart slammed in his chest. Memories of field hospitals rushed back the cries, the torn bodies, the stink of iron and smoke. Instinct surged. This woman was still breathing, but only barely. He knelt, pressed 2 fingers to her throat. A pulse faint, but alive. Her eyelids fluttered for an instant, dark eyes wide and wild, before she fell back into unconsciousness. If he wasted even a moment, that fragile rhythm could be gone, forever. Ethan gritted his teeth and made his choice. He couldn't leave her. Town was hours away, and with the sun dropping, cold settling in, she wouldn't last the night out here. Sliding his arms beneath her knees and back, he lifted. The weight was frighteningly light, as if he carried only skin and bone. She smelled of leather, sweat, and fear. He tightened his grip instinctively, holding her as though her life might slip through his arms. Ranger fell in close behind, snorting steam, ears twitching, guarding each step. The walk back to the cabin felt endless. Frozen grass snapped underfoot. Pain lanced Ethan's ribs with each stride, but he kept going, muttering to himself, just get her to the fire, just to the bed, just a chance to live, at last. The cabin door swung shut against the wind, and the space that had always felt hollow now turned into a sanctuary. Ethan laid her on the bed, stoked the stove until the iron glowed, boiled water, and scrubbed his hands. From a dented tin kit carried home from war, he drew out needle, thread, and carbolic. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from memory. He cut away the ruined sleeve. A deep slice ran across her shoulder, clotted with dried blood. Carefully, he cleaned it, stitched the edges with steady passes, and wrapped it tight in white cloth. She stirred once, but didn't wake. When it was done, Ethan sat back, lungs burning as if he had just come through battle. Who was she? What had she run from? Why had fate dropped her broken body right at his pasture's edge? Questions circled. But one thing was already decided from this moment forward. Ethan Ward bore the weight of her survival. Outside, the winter wind shrieked across the ridges. Inside, the stove popped and glowed, casting firelight over the stranger whose life now flickered in his care. Ethan turned his hat in his hands, watching the shallow rise and fall of her chest, and knew with cold certainty tonight, whether he wanted it or not, his life had taken a turn he could never undo. When the first light of morning slipped through the cabin's cracks, the fire in the stove had burned low, leaving only glowing embers like the eyes of a cat in the dark. Ethan Ward had dozed off in the wooden chair beside the bed, his neck stiff from sitting upright all night. He woke with a start at the faintest sound, the rustle of cloth, a shift in breathing. On the bed, the Apache girl stirred. At first it was only the faint tremor of a finger, then a frail hand tugging the blanket up closer to her chest. Her dark eyes opened, darting across the small room, the stove glowing dim, the shelves stacked with tins, the frosted window. When her gaze landed on Ethan, the air tightened like a bowstring drawn full. Ethan stayed still, both hands open at his sides, his voice low and steady. "You're safe now. No one will hurt you here." She didn't answer right away. Her lips moved in her own language, then shifted into broken English. "You, not soldier." Ethan shook his head once, eyes holding hers. Not anymore. That alone seemed to ease her shoulders, if only a little. But the wariness didn't leave. Her glance swept the cabin again, like a bird fallen from its nest, half willing to trust, half ready to flee at the first wrong move. Ethan pulled his chair back a few feet, giving her space. He tapped his chest slowly. Ethan Ward." She hesitated, then touched her own chest with fragile fingers. "Ahyoka." The name hung in the cabin, soft but weighted. Ethan nodded, memorizing it as though it already belonged in this place. He set a tin cup on the table, his voice gravelly but gentle. "Water. Drink." She hesitated, then reached for it with her good arm. Her fingers trembled, yet her eyes never left him, watching every move. When the water touched her lips, the sound of swallowing filled the silence. She drained the cup, then placed it back carefully, her hand clutching the blanket like a shield. A sudden noise broke the tension, the growl of her stomach. Ethan almost smiled, but caught himself, not wanting her to think he mocked her. He pointed to the pot of beans simmering on the stove, ladled some into a tin plate, and set it on the table. Then he stepped back, empty hands in plain sight. Her eyes flicked from him to the food. Only after a long pause did she lower her bare feet to the wooden floor. She shivered at the cold, and Ethan started to move, then stopped, too sudden, and she'd bolt. He waited. Ahyoka crossed to the chair, sat, and began to eat. At first cautiously, each bite slow, as though testing for a trap, but when nothing happened, her hand grew surer. Soon the plate was scraped clean. When she finished, she set it down with deliberate care and looked straight at him again, searching. Ethan held her gaze, steady as stone. His voice remained calm, deliberate. "You can stay, until you're strong again." Her brow furrowed at the word "stay," as if weighing it. Then she gave a small nod. The rest of the morning passed in wary silence. Ethan brewed coffee, washed the plate, split more wood. She watched his every move, her eyes sharp, as though she were measuring what kind of man he was, the kind to shout, strike, or lock doors, or the kind to keep still and steady. He knew trust wouldn't come at once. It had to be built, piece by piece, through the smallest of things. When he stepped outside to tend Ranger, Ahyoka stood in the doorway, wrapped in the flannel shirt he had left for her. Her small figure caught the pale light. bare feet resting on the cold floorboards. She said nothing, but her eyes followed him when he brushed the horse's mane, when he poured grain into the trough, when he turned back toward the cabin. Those eyes no longer held sheer terror, but caution still flickered there. Ethan felt it clearly. Her presence had cracked the shell of solitude he'd worn for years. Yet he knew too. Any false step might drive her away like a wild bird startled back into flight, leaving the cabin empty as before. That evening, when he came in from the barn, she was seated by the fire. Her torn dress was stretched across her knees as she stitched with an old spool of thread he had found. Firelight caught the lines of her face tight with wariness, but strong. Ethan stopped at the door, unwilling to disturb the fragile calm. The cabin was small, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel hollow. The air held something alive, still cautious, still defensive, but breathing. Challenging. New. And in Ethan's gut, a certainty grew. This girl had not escaped danger yet. Whatever shadow she had fled was still out there in the cold. But at least now, within these walls and this fragile moment, they had crossed the first threshold, a beginning. Fragile as thin ice, but a beginning nonetheless. The days that followed passed slowly, each hour stretched thin by the careful watchfulness between two strangers. The small cabin, once used to nothing but wind and the crack of burning wood, now carried another breath, another rhythm. Ethan Ward realized that every daily task of his suddenly had a pair of dark eyes following, not intruding, not interfering, only observing carefully, as though weighing whether this place was truly safe enough to stay. Each morning he tended the wound on Ahyoka's shoulder. He unwound the old bandage, washed the cut with boiled water, then wrapped it again in clean cloth. She sat still, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on his face. She never cried out, but sometimes her fingers tightened on the blanket, as if ready to spring up should he cross any line beyond healing. Ethan knew that look. It was the same wary gaze he had seen on soldiers he stitched up in the field, grateful for help, yet suspicious of the very hands that saved them. As the wound began to close, Ahyoka shifted from lying still to moving quietly around the cabin. In the mornings, when Ethan built the fire, she would set aside a few kindling sticks without a word. When he hauled water from the well, she followed, her bare feet pressing the frozen earth. He had offered her an old pair of wooden shoes, but she shook her head, tightening the frayed leather of her worn moccasins instead. Something about her refusal silenced him. In the kitchen corner, Ahyoka started rearranging, tin plates stacked neatly, the dusty corner near the hearth swept with a bundle of twigs she had found. Ethan sat at the table, pretending to busy himself with mending a harness strap, but in truth he was listening to her movements. It was a strange feeling, both familiar and hollowing for the first time since his wife's death. A woman's hands were tending this space, making the cabin less a shelter of stone and more a place alive. Yet closeness came with distance. Ahyoka never stepped too near. If Ethan passed close, she shifted a step aside. When he set food in front of her, she waited until his hand had withdrawn before touching the spoon. Every move she made kept a wall between them, a wall Ethan knew could only be lowered with time, not words. One afternoon, Ethan sat at the table repairing a cracked belt. Nearby, Ahyoka worked on stitching the torn hem of her dress with a ragged spool of thread. They said nothing, just sat in a shared silence, the slant of evening sun washing gold across two figures who remained apart. He noticed her hand tremble as she forced the needle through thick hide, but her eyes stayed steady. He nearly reached to help, then stopped. She needed to prove she could manage on her own more than she needed rescue. On another day, when Ethan hoisted a bucket from the well, Ahyoka grasped the handle of the second pail, wordlessly showing she wanted to share the load. He nodded. They walked back together, each carrying one, the frozen ground crunching beneath their steps. He realized her pace no longer hurried, no longer frantic. It matched his, though the space between them remained firm. At night, the cabin glowed with firelight. Ethan sat sharpening a knife while Ahyoka sat cross-legged by the stove, repairing her frayed moccasins. From time to time, their eyes met. There were no smiles, only the faintest nods and acknowledgement that they were sharing a roof, even as each kept their defenses high. For Ethan, these changes stirred buried memories. He remembered Mary, his wife, who had once filled this cabin with quiet domestic touches. Each small act of Ahyoka's recalled her presence, but also reminded him this Apache girl did not belong to memory. She was a fragile reality sitting before him, requiring careful respect in every word and gesture. On gray mornings, Ethan would rise early to feed Ranger, and by the time he returned, the cabin already smelled of fresh smoke, the fire tended by Ahyoka at dawn. He said nothing, only added more wood to the stove, but inside he felt a quiet warmth. Distance still lay between them, but the silence of the cabin was no longer complete. It was no longer his solitude alone, and so the days passed. The space between them remained, but familiarity grew. Ethan knew trust had not yet arrived, but a seed had been planted. And in the guarded gaze of Ahyoka, he saw the truth that mattered most. This girl was testing whether the small cabin in the frozen land could truly be safe enough to stop running, safe enough to rest her weary spirit, instead of vanishing like a wild bird into the cold sky. The first storm that swept through the valley shook the cabin as if it were a small boat caught in a raging sea. Wind howled down from the ridges, slipping through every crack in the boards, making the fire flare and fade as though it too was gasping for breath. Hail rattled hard against the roof, drumming like a war beat. Ethan Ward was no stranger to winter storms, yet even he rose more than once to check the door latch and the barn lock. Out in the stall, Ranger snorted and stamped, restless, as though he sensed more than weather pressing in from the dark. Inside the cabin, Ahyoka sat close to the stove, a blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. Her dark eyes kept darting toward the door each time the wind slammed it against its frame. Ethan saw the tension in her. This wasn't just fear of thunder or ice, it was deeper. The dread of footsteps in the night, the thought of pursuers using the storm as cover. He recognized it, because the storm in her gaze wasn't only the storm outside, it was the storm of men she had run from. He sat at the table, wiping down his rifle, keeping his tone even. It's just wind. No one's coming through this. But her eyes stayed on the door. After a long silence, she said softly, in broken English, "Bad men. Come at night." Ethan set the cloth aside. Firelight carved his face into planes of shadow. Slowly, he answered, voice carrying the weight of iron. "Not here. Not while I stand." Something in the way he said it made her exhale a little, but her hand still gripped the edge of the blanket tight. As the night deepened, the cold seeped in through every seam. Ethan spread a pallet of blankets near the stove, motioning for her to lie there. He was used to sleeping in a chair or on the floor. It didn't matter to him. But she didn't move, only sat rigid, eyes fixed on the dark corners of the room. Then, almost lost in the roar of the wind, came one word: cold. Ethan looked up. Her eyes met his. There was no pleading in them, only admission that the storm and the fear were gnawing at her. Then she added another word, slow and clear, close. For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. The meaning was plain. It wasn't desire, not even comfort of affection, but the simple instinct to survive warmth and the safety of proximity. He nodded. He pulled back the quilt on the bed and lay on one side, leaving a wide space. Ahyoka approached carefully, each step cautious as if she were a bird unsure of the branch. She slid beneath the blanket, turning her face toward the wall. The space between them was small, yet still a boundary. Ethan lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. Wind battered the roof. Hail struck in waves. His heart beat steady but heavy. He kept his body still, arms at his sides, honoring the invisible line between them. Then, after a time, he felt the light brush of her fingers against his shirt, not searching, not inviting, just resting there, like an anchor in the storm. He didn't move. He let it be, giving her what she asked for closeness without intrusion. And strangely, the silence between them became something steadier than words. That night, the cabin no longer felt like the tomb Ethan had carried since his wife's death. It became a refuge, sheltering two souls pressed by storms, one man hollowed by loss, one young woman trembling in the shadow of pursuit. By dawn, pale light crept through the window. The storm had broken, leaving the cabin still standing, the stove still alive. Ethan opened his eyes to find Ahyoka already awake, her gaze no longer wild, but steady, watchful. Across the narrow space between them, a thread had been spun, not yet trussed, but the fragile sign of it. He rose, pulled on his coat, and stepped to the door. Beyond, the land was buried in white, the air sharp and clean. Inside, she still sat on the bed, blanket around her shoulders, her eyes following him. Between the winter's chill and the cautious space they still held, Ethan knew something had sparked to life in the night, small, tentative, but strong enough to survive even when the storms returned. That afternoon, the sky pressed low, heavy clouds sagging over the valley like a wool blanket. Ethan Ward was splitting wood in the yard when Ranger suddenly whinnied from the stall, ears stiff, eyes fixed on the trail that wound down from the ridge. Hoofbeats carried on the frozen ground steady, deliberate. Ethan tightened his grip on the axe, that old soldier's instinct pulling him upright. A rider approached, coat collar turned up high against the wind. He didn't look like a neighbor or a trader passing through. Every motion spoke of caution, his eyes glinting beneath the brim of a wide hat. Ethan set the axe aside, one hand sliding toward the rifle leaning against the doorframe. The stranger reined up in the yard, forcing a thin smile. His voice had a hard edge beneath the casual tone. Cold evening. I'm looking for someone. Heard she might have run this way. Young Apache woman. Wears deerskin. Scar on the shoulder. At the mention. Ethan's eyes didn't flicker. He stepped forward, planting himself square in front of the cabin door, broad shoulders cutting off the man's line of sight. His reply was rough, steady. Lot of country out here. Haven't seen anyone like that. The rider squinted, gaze sliding past Ethan toward the cabin. He drew a slow breath. Wouldn't take but a minute to look around. The air seemed to freeze solid. Ethan shifted forward, his shadow stretching long over the snow. You won't be looking here. Inside. Ahyoka heard every word. She clutched the blanket tighter, her heart hammering. Fear surged, but beneath it was something new realization. Ethan had chosen to stand square in the doorway, his words leaving no room for doubt. The stranger's mouth twisted into a sneer. He spat in the snow, his voice sharpening. If you are keeping her, that's trouble. Folks pay high to have her back. Ethan's tone stayed even, but his eyes were hard as iron. She isn't worth a dime to you. Turn your horse. For a moment the yard held its breath. Only the steam of horses and the hiss of the wind filled the space. Then, with a sharp jerk of the reins, the stranger turned, muttering, You'll regret this. Ward, you're standing on the wrong side. He kicked his horse, hooves crunching over ice until both man and beast disappeared beyond the pines. Ethan stood still, rifle in hand, watching until the trail was empty again. When he stepped back inside, Ahyoka was pressed against the wall, eyes wide, breath shallow. For a heartbeat, she expected him to tell her to leave, to run before the man returned with others. Instead, Ethan slid the wooden bar across the door and spoke plainly, steady as stone. "No one's taking you from here. Not now. Not ever." Her dark eyes shimmered, though no tears fell. In that look, beneath the last threads of caution, she saw what she had never seen in other men. He didn't measure her as property, didn't weigh her as burden. He had chosen to stand in front, to guard. Ethan sat down at the table, broke open his rifle, cleaned each part, and set cartridges in a neat row. The sharp, steady clicks of metal filled the cabin like warning bells. Ahyoka watched, drawing the blanket closer not from fear now, but to hold in the fragile warmth spreading through her chest. Outside, the wind still carried the scent of danger down from the ridge. But inside, for the first time she knew there was a place, and a man, willing to stand at the door and keep her safe. Winter lay heavy over the valley, wrapping everything in a thick white blanket. Each day began with the crack of wood in the stove and the frosted breath of Ranger in the stall. Ethan Ward was used to such winters, but this one was different. He was no longer working alone. Ahyoka, her shoulder still marked with a red scar, could now move with more ease. She followed Ethan outside, carrying small armfuls of wood, her hands slight but steady. At first, Ethan told her it wasn't necessary, but the resolve in her eyes silenced him. There was something in that look that seemed to say, "I'm not here just to be saved, I'm here to live alongside you." They worked side by side in a quiet rhythm. When Ethan reset a broken fence rail, Ahyoka stood by, holding the nails, passing the hammer. Each time their hands brushed, they both paused, but neither pulled away as quickly as before. The gap between them was closing, not with words, but with the steady familiarity of shared labor. Inside the cabin, while Ethan sharpened knives or patched tack, Ahyoka sat near the fire sewing scraps of cloth. Sometimes she looked up, pointing at an object and asking in halting English name. This Ethan would answer slowly. "One word at a time. Spoon. Plate. Window," she repeated, her voice rough but her eyes bright when she came close to the sound. And when he nodded, a fleeting smile touched her lips, the first he had seen since the day he carried her in. Gradually, the cabin ceased to feel like a place divided by silence. It became a small schoolroom, Ahyoka repeating simple words. Ethan, once a man of few, discovering a patience he never thought he still possessed. With each exchange, their eyes met longer, the distance shortening bit by bit. One afternoon, snow fell so thick it blanketed the yard in white haze. Ethan split logs on the porch while Ahyoka swept the steps clear. When the wind tugged loose strands of her braid, she bent to catch them. And in that instant, Ethan saw her differently, not just as the wary fugitive he had taken in, but as someone present, alive, and belonging here. He turned quickly away, but the image stayed with him. That evening, the smell of beans filled the cabin. Ahyoka dropped in a few dried chilies from a small pouch, and the sharp warmth filled the air. Ethan ate at the table, surprised to realize the flavor stirred his appetite. She noticed, quietly cut an extra piece of bread, and set it by his hand. Such a simple act, yet to Ethan it felt like an intimacy he hadn't known in years. After supper, he sat repairing a strap. Ahyoka leaned closer, pointing at the leather. "Name." "This strap," Ethan answered. She repeated it, a little off, then gave a soft laugh. That laugh lit the cabin brighter than the fire itself. Ethan's hand trembled slightly as he passed the strap for her to hold. Their fingers touched, and this time neither drew back. When night fell and the fire crackled low, Ethan moved to lay a blanket on the floor as usual, but Ahyoka rose first, stepped to the bed, and slipped beneath the covers as though it was the most natural thing. She turned toward the wall, leaving space beside her. Ethan hesitated, then lay down on the other side. They lay in silence, the shadows long. At last, she turned back, her dark eyes meeting his in the glow of the fire. Her voice was a whisper. "You." Not afraid, Ethan held her gaze. "Not of you." Her shoulders eased. She reached across us, touched his hand lightly. Then, gathering her courage, she leaned closer and pressed her lips softly to his, a kiss slow but certain. Ethan stilled, then rested his hand gently on her shoulder, not pulling her closer, only anchoring the moment. But to Ahyoka, that was enough. With the kiss, she spoke the words not in her own tongue, nor in broken English, but with her heart. "I stay. In the small cabin, in the dead of winter." Two souls who had been strangers found a closeness new and fragile. No vows, no promises, only a kiss and two breaths mingling in the quiet. The cabin was no longer just a refuge from storms. It had begun to turn into a home. That morning, the wind carried the sharp scent of ice down from the ridge. Ethan Ward had just set aside his axe when Ranger in the stall gave a sharp warning snort. Ears pricked forward. Down the snow-crusted trail came two riders. Ethan knew them at once, the man who had ridden up before, and another, bigger, with a scar carved deep along his jaw. Ethan stepped off the porch, one hand sliding to rest on the rifle at his side. He didn't hurry, but each step across the yard was steady and sure. Inside the cabin, Ahyoka heard the hoofbeats. Her hand gripped the table's edge, heart pounding. But she didn't run to hide. Instead, she stood near the door, watching the figure of the man who had chosen to stand for her once already. The riders pulled up in the yard. The first man spoke, voice stretched thin with mock courtesy. "Ward, we asked once, and you know well what we're after. That girl's worth more than you figure. This is the last time we ask polite." Ethan said nothing at first. He stood straight, his gaze flat and calm, shoulders squared against the wind. Ranger pawed hard in the stall, snorting, as if to throw his weight in with his master. At last, Ethan spoke, voice low and iron-heavy. "She isn't worth a thing to you. Turn your horses." The scarred man gave a grin, leaning in his saddle to glance at the cabin. Ahyoka was there in the doorway, small but upright, back straight. "Pretty thing," he said under his breath. "Shame to waste her on a frozen hole like this." Ethan's jaw locked. He stepped forward, hand set on the rifle's stock, tone dropping into steel. "One more step, and neither of you rides back." The yard went silent, breath hanging in the frozen air. Then Ranger screamed loud, slamming his hooves down on the packed snow. The sudden movement set the stranger's horses sidestepping, reins jerking in their fists. Ethan didn't move, but the line was drawn clear in his stance across it. And pay in blood. For a long moment the three men held still. Then the scarred rider spat into the snow, growling, "Not worth it. But you've picked your side. Ward, next time, no talk." They yanked their reins, turning back down the trail. Hooves cracked against the ice, carrying them out of sight. Ethan stood watching until the pines swallowed their shapes, then lowered his rifle, breath steaming in the cold air. When he turned back, Ahyoka still stood in the doorway. Her eyes were wide, filled not only with fear, but with something steadier trust beginning to take root. She stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. "They come again." Ethan met her gaze, honest and unflinching. "Maybe. If they do, we'll be ready." She held still for a heartbeat, then placed her hand on his chest where his heart still beat hard from the standoff. "I ready too." Ethan gave a slow nod, his eyes softening. He reached into his coat and drew out a small knife, the steel glinting in the pale light. turning the hilt toward her. He set it in her palm. "If they come, you don't just stand by. You fight with this." Ahyoka's fingers curled around the handle, her dark eyes alight. Not because she craved violence, but because in that moment she was no longer a burden, she was his equal. She lifted her chin, speaking one word with quiet conviction, "Together." And there, in the frozen yard, the last wall between them broke. The cabin was no longer a place of refuge for a widowed man and a hunted girl. It had become a fortress for two souls united ready to fight, not just to survive, but to guard the fragile bond they had found in each other. When the sound of hooves finally faded beyond the pines, the tension that had gripped the air slowly ebbed away. Ethan Ward stood for a long while, eyes fixed on the pale horizon. By the fire, Ahyoka still held the small knife he had given her, turning it in her hand. The steel caught the glow, but what shone brighter was the trust, now alive in her gaze. That night, they said little, but their silence was its own vow from this moment on. They would face storms together, whether from sky or from men. The next day dawned with a new kind of peace. The sky remained gray, the ground still buried in snow. Yet the cabin felt transformed. Ethan rose to find Ahyoka already tending the fire, warmth spilling through the room. When he stepped to the barn, she walked beside him, carrying a small bucket. Ranger lowered his head, breathing into her palm as though recognizing her as part of the family. Ethan felt a smile tug at his mouth, rare as it was, for even the horse had accepted her now. Winter work was steady. A fence rail had blown loose in the storm and needed mending. Ethan lifted the heavy beams while Ahyoka held the nails and hammer, her dark eyes watching every move. Their breaths hung in the air, white against the cold, and when a stubborn post bounced back and nearly knocked Ethan off balance, she laughed. He turned toward her, caught by surprise, and then laughed himself. For the first time in years, laughter rang out across the frozen yard, turning that bleak stretch of land into something alive. Inside, Ahyoka arranged their meals with care. Ethan, once used to swallowing his food quickly and alone, now lingered at the table, savoring spoonfuls of beans and hard bread. It wasn't just that the food tasted better. It was the presence across from him, the dark eyes that watched, waiting for his approval. One evening, with snow pressing against the windows, Ethan sat at the small table. In his hands was an old horseshoe nail, heated and bent with steady pressure from his pliers. Ahyoka, mending cloth nearby, watched him without a word. Slowly, carefully, he shaped it into a rough circle, smoothing its edges. When he was done, a small ring glimmered in the firelight. He set it on the table between them. "You don't have to wear it," Ethan said, voice low and unsteady. Ahyoka studied it for a long moment, then lifted it, turning it in her fingers. Her hands bore new calluses from working beside him. At last, she slipped the ring onto her finger and looked up, a faint smile forming. "I wear..." 3 simple words, but they struck Ethan deep. His chest tightened, his hands clenched as though to steady his heart. In her gaze he saw no fear, no hesitation, only choice. She was no longer just a fugitive, no longer a stranger. She was part of this place, part of him. That night they ate by the fire. 2 cups, 2 plates, warmth filling the cabin. There was no preacher, no papers, no crowd to bear witness. But Ethan knew with certainty the moment she wore that ring was the moment a home began. The next morning, dawn broke over the ridge, spilling pale gold across the snow. Ethan stepped onto the porch, his hand clasping Ahyoka's. Ranger whinnied, pawing at the drifts. The sky was vast and clear. They stood together in silence, looking out over the white valley. No more running, no more hiding, just the 2 of them, starting fresh tending the horse, mending the fence, feeding the fire, and holding on to a future built not from loneliness, but from choice. For Ethan, it was rebirth. After years of believing life had ended with his wife's passing, he had found meaning again. For Ahyoka, it was belonging perhaps for the first time in her life. Friends, especially those of you who have lived long enough to understand the worth of a home, maybe this story reminds us happiness does not always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it begins with small things, an iron nail turned into a ring, a fire lit in a cold cabin, a hand reaching for another's. If you've come to care for Ethan and Ahyoka, I invite you to press that like button and share in the comments what you hope to see in their journey ahead. Perhaps more winters will come. Perhaps more men who will not let go. Yet the truth is this: they are no longer alone. The question now is, will they build this cabin into a lasting ranch, or venture farther, staking their claim on a wider frontier? One thing is certain that morning. As dawn lit the land and their fingers twined together, Ethan and Ahyoka ceased to be survivors. They had become a family. And out here on the frontier, family is the greatest miracle of all.